Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 14th of May 2012, the podcast that's crispy on the outside and juicy on the inside. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's pervertedly pat down the news of the bogus. It seems that as more time passes, the TSA's atrocities get greater and greater. After many claims by the TSA that people can opt out of body scanners, known as Advanced Imaging Technology or AIT, and get a pat-down instead, Colorado teenager Savannah Berry, diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, was forced to go through an AIT scanner, breaking her insulin pump. Berry was returning home from a school trip when TSA screeners directed her through the scanner. She told them that her condition meant that she shouldn't be subjected to it, showed them a note from her doctor stating this, and requested a pat-down instead. They refused and forced her to go through the machine. According to Savannah's mother, Sandra, quote, "Believe me, being 16 and female, she probably doesn't want the pat-down, but she knows that this is what's required. She tried to advocate for herself, and they just shut her down." According to the TSA's website, quote, "AIT is optional for everybody. If you decide to opt out of AIT screening, you must undergo alternative screening, which will include a pat-down." So why wasn't it optional for Berry? If it's optional for everybody, why isn't it optional for people with medical conditions who have a note from their doctor? The insulin pump, which cost $10,000, was permanently damaged by the procedure and had to be disconnected immediately when she landed. Who could have foreseen something like this after 9/11? The security measures put in place since then have been largely welcomed by the American people, who have ignored those claiming that there would be unforeseen consequences. Well, now the consequences are here, and it's time people learn the lesson. The biggest problems inherent with government action are not the ones intended, but the ones we can't see coming. The problems we've been seeing with abusive cops, it needs to be said again, is not a failure of individual cops. It's a systemic problem resulting in a particular attitude that lets them get away with horrendous behavior. Case in point, DeKalb County Police Officer Jared Wheeler was called to the home of Raven Dozier, then almost 9 months pregnant, on a domestic dispute. Wheeler kicked Dozier in the stomach, and his department says it was completely within policy. The dispute involved Dozier's brother and his baby's mother. Wheeler had pulled out his taser and used it on the brother, at which point Dozier started crying and asking him to stop. She asked him why he was tasering her brother, and that's when he turned around and kicked her right in the stomach. According to Dozier, quote, "I think he really just didn't want me asking any questioning him. And when I did question him is when he kicked me. I was upset because I couldn't believe an officer would kick me with my child in my stomach." Dozier ended up giving birth by emergency C-section. The baby, now 4 months old, is thankfully healthy, but the department says that Wheeler's actions were within department policy. What? Wheeler claimed to not be able to tell that she was pregnant, but a picture of a bruised Dozier shows that there was no way he could not have been able to tell. He just didn't care. And why should he? He knew that he wouldn't get punished by his department. How did he know that? Because Wheeler didn't get in trouble last year after he twisted a 53-year-old woman's arm behind her back and shoved her face down onto his patrol car when she was just trying to check on her grandchildren who had just been in a car accident. And he didn't get in trouble this January after showing up to the wrong address and, that's right, shooting the family dog. How long are people going to claim that these are just isolated instances? How long are people going to deny the fact that if you let people, even cops, get away with bad behavior, they'll just do more of it and get worse and worse the longer it goes on? No one should kick a pregnant woman in the stomach, let alone a policeman sworn to protect and serve. There need to start being consequences when they act against the very reason they're supposed to exist. During the Cold War, the U.S. government encouraged people to build underground bunkers as a safety measure against possible attack by the Russians. Many of these bunkers survive to this day, including one owned by Air Force veteran Joe Del Rio, which he has since made into a workshop. Apparently, the mere existence of this bunker was enough for the Austin Police Department to send a SWAT team to his home, burst through his door, and detain and interrogate the 70-year-old man for over 10 hours. And what prompted this raid? 2 empty oil drums that he had in his backyard. When asked what was in the barrels, Del Rio said nothing, but they wouldn't believe him. You'd think they could have just checked, right? They also found guns in the house, but they were legal possessions, and a forensics team said they had never been used in any crime. This sounds like a mistake that should easily be cleared up, right? But no, the city of Austin fenced off his home and prevented him from entering, evacuated his neighbors, and removed utility meters, making the house uninhabitable. They posted a red sign on the fence which read, "Warning, a dangerous condition exists." They then filled the bunker and his basement with 264 tons of concrete and then sent him a bill for $90,000. And then they seized his property without one penny of compensation, in complete abrogation of the Fifth Amendment. The property is valued at $172,000, or at least it was before the city condemned it. As to why all this happened, Del Rio said, quote, "In my opinion, they wanted my property to start with, and this was a way to take my property away from me." Del Rio is now attempting to sue the city. Best of luck to him. One hopes it will be open and shut. A bunker that the U.S. government encouraged people to build should not be a reason to call a property dangerous, fill it with concrete, take the property from him, and send him a bill to boot. But after the Kelo decision, I guess this sort of thing happens more and more often nowadays. According to the city of Austin, they condemned the property, quote, "due to a public safety risk caused by the structure located on the property." But this seems to be nothing more than a ruse to gain the property. According to Jeffrey Tucker, a structural engineer who inspected the property, quote, "It appeared it was structurally safe. I did not see anything that indicated it would fall in." And according to Del Rio, quote, "I've gotten the runaround. I think they want the property. Condemning it is a cheap way to get it." Del Rio spent 22 years as a security guard for the Austin City Council. You'd think that would earn him some consideration, but I guess not when bureaucrats get their eye on a piece of property. A woman, after repeated bullying of her gay son, which included throwing rocks and other physical threats, in desperation gave her son a taser to defend himself with, and as a result, school officials now want to expel her son, with no punishment to the bullies as usual. According to his mother, Chelsea Grimes, quote, "I had to do something. They throw bottles and rocks at him." But what happened when she tried to get the school to react? She was told her son was to blame for being openly gay. Quote, "They said that the problem was that he was too flamboyant with his bags and his purses and his rings." The behavior also included dancing to Beyoncé's Single Ladies at his high school talent show, a performance which won him second place. Only after repeated refusals by school officials to help him did she give him the taser to defend himself with. She has known her son was gay since he was a little boy. Quote, "Everybody in my family knew he was gay, so we just loved him. He came out as a freshman, and some isolated teasing aside, it wasn't a problem until he started at Tech High School last fall. Then the problem started, escalating to the point where he thought about committing suicide. He went from a student who made A's and B's to a student who brought home F's. He started losing weight, and still the bullying continued, and still, even after more than 10 complaints, the school officials did nothing about it. In fact, Principal Larry Yarl said they were trying to help the boy by getting him to tone down his homosexuality. Quote, "Kids are kids, and they're going to say whatever it is they want to say. Because you want to be different, and because you choose to wear female apparel, it may happen." No, Yarl, you're supposed to punish kids when they do this, not make excuses for them. I don't care if he dresses like Starchild. It is no excuse for bullying and no excuse for you not to do anything about it. Yarl's excuse? He just couldn't find out who they were. Quote, "I spent hours trying to figure out and find out who the perpetrators were. I ran up on dead ends because no one could give me a description." That was when Grimes gave her son the stun gun. Quote, "We're not trying to hurt anyone, we're just trying to protect him." Then, on April 16, he was surrounded by 6 students making physical threats. He pulled out the stun gun and fired it into the air so it would make its noise, and they backed off. Minutes later, police officers came to his class, found the stun gun, and handcuffed him. He faces not only expulsion, but criminal charges as well. Oh, sure, you can't figure out who the bullies are, despite the fact that the school has surveillance cameras everywhere. You can't punish them, but the moment a bullied student defends himself, doesn't even touch the bullies, just scare them away, you take action and get things done within minutes. Am I really the only one who sees the problem here? He was very responsible with a stun gun. He carried it for weeks without incident. Then, when surrounded and threatened, he didn't even take action directly against them, just held it up in the air. And any halfway decent investigator would know how to track down the bullies, how to persuade at least one witness, and there were plenty of witnesses, to give them a description. But we see this all the time in government schools, and it's nothing new. The bullies go free, the bullied get punished, and the administrators do nothing. Generally because they're bullies themselves. Is it any wonder more and more parents want school choice? Daniel Chong, a student at the University of California at San Diego, experienced the horrors of the drug war firsthand when the DEA detained him for 5 days, completely neglecting him to the point of not even bringing him food and water. Chong had done nothing more than go with a few friends to smoke some marijuana on 420. But the DEA raided and arrested Chong and 8 other students in a suspected ecstasy distribution ring. The others were processed, but Chong was accidentally left in a holding cell. He was found after 5 days with no food, water, or access to toilet facilities, having drank his own urine and attempting suicide by breaking his glasses and attempting to slash his wrists with the shards. He had many attempts to alert the guards to his presence, including screaming and kicking on the door to his cell. When they found him, he was close to kidney failure and had trouble breathing, and had to spend 3 days in an intensive care unit. He also used a white powder, which turned out to be methamphetamine that he had found in his cell, left there from a previous prisoner. Oh, nice one, DEA. Can't even keep drugs out of your own cells. Senator Barbara Boxer of California has called on U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder to launch an investigation and find out what the hell happened. Quote, "After the investigation is completed, I ask that you please provide me with the results and the actions the department will take to make sure those responsible are held accountable and that no one in DEA custody will ever again be forced to endure such treatment." Hey Boxer, I've got a better idea. How about ending the hideous and insane war on drugs, and then nothing like this would ever happen to begin with? And now it's time to drop kick through the goalposts of honesty, this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Michigan Secretary of State Ruth Johnson is refusing to print the name of Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party's 2012 presidential nominee, on the Michigan ballot, even though the Michigan Libertarian Party has properly obtained ballot access. What's her reasoning? Hear it from Johnson herself. Governor Johnson's name was placed on the Republican presidential primary ballot at his request following numerous communications with this office. A candidate who wished to withdraw from the presidential primary was required to file an affidavit indicating a preference for another political party no later than 4 p.m. on the second Friday in December. Because Governor Johnson's affidavit was received at 4:03 p.m. on December 9, 2011, after the statutory deadline had elapsed, his request to withdraw was void. Governor Johnson was authorized by law to withdraw his name from the ballot until 4:00 p.m. on December 9, 2011, but the governing statute simply does not allow a candidate to effectuate a withdrawal at any time after that. Really? 3 minutes after the deadline and you're saying it's invalid? Give me a break. Okay, so he was 3 minutes late withdrawing from the Republican primary. So what? This is the Libertarian ticket we're talking about. How is that relevant? Ruth Johnson cites Michigan's so-called sore loser laws. Quote, "No person whose name was printed or placed on the primary ballots or voting machines as a candidate for nomination on the primary ballots of one political party shall be eligible as a candidate of any other political party at the election following the primary." But there's a problem. This law was enacted in 1955, before Michigan started having presidential primaries. During that time, it has always been the precedent that the sore loser law does not apply to presidential races. In 1980, independent presidential candidate John Anderson formed his own party in Michigan for the purpose of ballot access. He was on the ballot despite the fact that he had run in the Michigan Republican presidential primary. Ruth Johnson is going against precedent here. But she has her excuse already. Quote, Michigan's sore loser law does not bar the candidate of one political party whose name appears on the primary ballot from running as an independent candidate at the subsequent election. But again, he didn't run as an independent in Michigan. He formed his own party. She also bleats, quote, at the time, state law did not provide independent candidates a mechanism to qualify for the ballot. This is a complete lie. In the 1976 ruling McCarthy v. Austin, an independent candidate can just make up his own petition form and collect the same number of signatures that were required by a new party and get on the ballot. Moreover, Ruth Johnson knows about this ruling because she cited it in the very next sentence. She quote mines it, saying they ruled, quote, that Michigan's election laws are constitutionally deficient to the extent that they fail to permit independent candidates not affiliated with any political party a position in the official state ballot on terms and conditions equal to those of partisan candidates. But she dishonestly ignores the fact that the ruling gave the remedy to allow independent candidates to do just this. Ruth Johnson stated directly, quote, thus, in 1980, there was no mechanism for an independent candidate for president to obtain access to the ballot. But that very ruling gave just such a mechanism. Very dishonest indeed. But the biggest argument here, and one that Ruth Johnson doesn't even try to rebut, is that voters in the general election do not vote for the presidential candidate. They vote for a slate of electors, chosen at the party's state convention, and those electors vote for the presidential candidate. Putting Gary Johnson on the ballot is simply a shorthand. Voting for Johnson actually votes for the electors who were nominated at the convention, pledging to vote for Johnson in the Electoral College. Michigan's precedent is absolutely on the side of citizens voting for the electors, not the candidates, and several times, placeholder names have served for those electors, even though those candidates were known to be under 35 years of age and therefore ineligible for election as president. Absolutely everything in Michigan law allows the Libertarian Party to vote for their slate of electors. Stopping Gary Johnson from getting on the ballot means stopping the Michigan LP for voting for these electors, as is absolutely their right. If Ruth Johnson doesn't change her mind, the Michigan LP will sue, and they have a lot of legal precedent on their side. It's clear that Ruth Johnson, a Republican, just doesn't want Gary Johnson and the Libertarians on the ballot and is using any means she can, even illegal ones, to keep them off. Here's hoping the Michigan LP prevails. If nothing else, they can have whatever morale boost they get from the fact that Ruth Johnson is so dishonest that only she could be named this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to monetarily devalue this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. And this time, it's David Ellerman of the group Abolish Human Rentals, who posted a screed of economic ignorance so moronic it would make even Paul Krugman blush. And like a good Marxist, Ellerman treats the fact that we can actually work for money and afford things for ourselves as a kind of slavery, and economics as a hateful, immoral philosophy that treats humans like chattel, their only value being their labor services. His whole screed is a lame attempt to support the labor theory of property, which says basically that if a worker makes a chair at a furniture factory, that he, in fact, owns that chair, ignoring all of the other things that went into it, such as the capital inputs and design work, that the worker had absolutely nothing to do with. The first so-called peculiarity he covers is, quote, workers may not be bought and sold, only rented or hired. Yes, because the free market hates slavery. Imagine that. Why does he call it a peculiarity? Because, quote, modern economics bases one of its proudest achievements, a competitive equilibrium is allocatively efficient, on the assumption that the perfectly competitive capitalist model incorporates what is essentially a voluntary contractual form of slavery. What? A voluntary, contractual form of slavery? Hey, Ellerman, I got a hint for you. If it's voluntary, it's not slavery. Slavery is forced servitude. Slavery is ownership of another human being. Ellerman comes right out and says what others try to dance around, that they're crapping all over the graves of real slaves who fought and died to become free. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass are used and abused solely so he can make his bogus points. Not only is the claim factually incorrect, it's morally reprehensible. Now get this next part. The inability of capitalist economics to recognize any unique and relevant characteristic of labor is an ideological blind spot based on the desire to theoretically reflect the symmetrical fact that both labor services and the services of land and capital are saleable commodities in the employment system. Any fundamental differentiation of labor from the other factor services would threaten that symmetry. Gee, I guess that's why they always put labor as a separate variable in the production function. Has this guy never even so much as cracked open a basic macroeconomics textbook? In fact, the three things he mentions, labor, land, and also other natural resources, and capital are all separate variables in the function. Again, he's distorting actual economics to try to make his bogus point, and I'm not even sure what that's supposed to be here. Presumably it has something to do with labor theory of property, but he's so off the deep end it's hard to follow. After directly relying on Marx for several of his points, really, this is like citing Lamarck in a discussion on evolution. He then moves to his main claim, that only labor can be responsible for production. This is easily refuted by a simple thought experiment. Let's say I have a planet just like Earth in every way, except it never had any people on it. I'm going to let you use this planet to make whatever you want and give you as many laborers as you want to make it with. I dump you on there and wait for your product to emerge. How would you do it? How would you make an iPhone or a car? How would you even make something as simple as a wooden spoon? If you think through all of the things you would need to give and teach your laborers in order to make your product, you find that there's a lot of those things, and they're all considered capital. Capital is actually what makes us wealthier, because otherwise we'd have to start all over and make everything from scratch every time. We would never have developed our modern technical society with all of its benefits, including longer, more fulfilled lives, without it. And also, he seems to think that labor is the only kind of input that human beings can have. But where does he think all this capital comes from to begin with? From human beings taking the risk to innovate and create and design new things that never existed before, that benefit many people, often in completely unforeseen ways. He concludes, the question of de facto responsibility, whether posed in a courtroom or outside, presupposes the understanding that persons act and things don't. Yet it is precisely the presupposition that is overlooked in economic theory, which treats both the services of human beings and the services of capital and land symmetrically as input services. Economists chose to limit their description of the human activity of production to an engineering description of the casual efficiency of the various types of input services. The unique responsible agency of human activities is not acknowledged. What a big, stinking, heaping pile of bogosity. It is precisely because of human action, of taking responsibility, assuming risks, and reaping either the rewards or the losses that makes a capitalist economy work. There is no thing that can do that other than a human mind. In fact, most of the time when economics goes wrong, it's because some economist somewhere has forgotten this. But when economics works, it's because the economists in question have taken this to heart. There is a place for the labor theory of property, such as in homesteading. Someone laying claim to unowned land and laboring on it for productive use makes it his property. But it's no less his property just because he decides to pay other laborers some of his hard-earned money to do the work for him. If it were, the whole basis of our economy would collapse, and humanity would never have made it past the agricultural revolution. All of which means that David Ellerman is a complete shoo-in for this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! Well, that wraps up this economic, autonomic, ergonomic, subatomic, diatomic, Marvel comic, gastronomic, and tragic comic edition of the Bogosity podcast. please visit the forums at Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free, but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Milton Friedman. The great virtue of a free market system is that it does not care what color people are. It does not care what their religion is. It only cares whether they can produce something you want to buy. It is the most effective system we have discovered to enable people who hate one another to deal with one another and help one another. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.